You're being let go, effective today. Please surrender your access badge before you leave the building. He didn't look up, didn't even pause typing. Just read it off the screen like he was canceling a subscription service, not ending 31 years of someone's career. My son-in-law, my daughter's husband of 4 years, the man I watched cry at his own wedding, sat in the chair that used to belong to me and told me I was done. No eye contact, no explanation, just the words, a manila envelope slid across the desk, and the sound of his keyboard clicking again before I'd even processed what happened. I'm 58 years old. I've been in pharmaceutical manufacturing since I was 27, when the founders of Crestline BioTech were still arguing about what to name the company. I designed the process validation framework that got our first FDA approval. I negotiated the supplier contracts that kept us solvent through 2 recessions. I trained half the department heads who were now sitting 1 floor above me, pretending they hadn't just watched a family soap opera play out in the executive suite. And my son-in-law, let's call him my son-in-law, because that's the only title that matters here, fired me on his 2nd week as CEO. I didn't argue. Didn't raise my voice. I picked up the envelope, tucked it under my arm, and said one thing before I walked out. Make sure your legal team has read the licensing agreements, all of them, especially Exhibit C. He finally looked up. I left anyway. If you've ever been in a situation where someone handed you the raw end of a deal they didn't fully understand, you know that particular mix of fury and cold clarity that settles in right after. I wasn't shaking, I was calculating. And I want you to stick with me here, because what happened next took exactly 72 hours to fully detonate, and every hour of it was worth waiting for. If this is the kind of story that makes you want to see corporate power go exactly where it was supposed to go, hit that like button before we get into it. The channel runs on people who appreciate a well-documented comeback. Now, let me tell you about Exhibit C. Crestline BioTech started in a leased office suite in Raleigh, North Carolina, with 2 founders, 1 shared assistant, and a vision for a faster cell culture processing system that nobody in the industry thought would work. I joined in year 3 when they had 11 employees and a pilot program that kept failing validation because nobody on staff understood how to document process deviations in a way the FDA would actually accept. That was my specialty, not glamorous. Not the stuff of LinkedIn inspiration posts. But if your process documentation fails, your product never reaches market, period. The FDA doesn't care how good your science is if you can't prove it's reproducible. I cared about that. Obsessively. The founders, 2 research scientists who were brilliant in the lab and helpless in a regulatory meeting, made me VP of operations within 18 months. But when they offered me a raise to go with the title, I made a different ask. I told them I wanted co-ownership of the proprietary process documentation system I built. Not the company, not equity in the business, just the intellectual property behind the validation framework itself. The methodology, the templates, the deviation tracking architecture, all of it registered in my name as the original author, with an exclusive licensing agreement back to Crestline for use in production. The older founder thought it was eccentric. The younger one, who understood IP law better, spent 3 days talking to their attorney about it. In the end, they agreed. It was a small concession at the time. They didn't need to own something they could already use indefinitely as long as I stayed. And the license said something interesting. Something I'd written carefully with the help of a very good IP attorney whom I paid out of my own pocket. If the licensor, meaning me, is terminated without cause by the licensee, meaning Crestline, all licensing rights revert immediately to the licensor. The company would have 90 days to transition off the proprietary system or negotiate a new licensing agreement at fair market value. Any product currently in the regulatory pipeline using the proprietary documentation framework would be flagged as potentially non-compliant pending licensor review. In plain English, if they fired me without cause, I took the rulebook with me. 31 years of product development had been built on that framework. Every FDA submission, every process validation report, every deviation log in our history, all of it used my methodology. We had 4 drugs currently in active regulatory review. 2 of them were in phase 3 clinical trials. 1 was 6 weeks from a biologics license application submission that the company had spent 11 years and over $300 million preparing for. My son-in-law read a termination script off his screen on the Tuesday morning and had no idea he'd just pulled the pin on a grenade that had been sitting in the filing cabinet since 2003. I didn't celebrate. I went home, made a pot of coffee, and called my IP attorney. He answered on the second ring. I told him what happened. There was a pause. Did you document the lack of cause? The termination letter cites strategic realignment and leadership restructuring. No performance issues cited. No corrective action plan. No prior documentation. Another pause. Then the clause is active. I know. I'll have the reversion notice ready by end of day. Thank you. I hung up, drank my coffee, and waited. Here's what was happening at Crestline while I sat in my kitchen watching the birds at the feeder my wife put up last spring. My son-in-law was presumably sending a company-wide email about exciting new directions. He'd been telegraphing this kind of language for weeks. Words like agility and streamlined leadership and fresh perspective. He was 34 years old with an MBA from Duke and 4 years working in strategy consulting before my daughter married him, and he slowly, patiently, inserted himself into conversations about the company's future. I don't think my daughter knew what he was doing, not entirely. I want to be fair about that. She's not a calculating person. He is. He'd been having lunches with 2 board members for the past 6 months. I know because one of them told me, not as a warning, just as casual conversation. He didn't think it was significant. I did. The CEO transition had been positioned as my idea, a planned succession. I was approaching 60, the board wanted a transition plan, and my son-in-law was there, enthusiastic, credentialed, and married to the founder's granddaughter. Well, to my daughter, who is the founder's granddaughter, which is how this whole tangled thing connects. What nobody on the board fully understood was that my son-in-law had pushed for the transition timeline to accelerate. What they also didn't know, because I hadn't told them, was that I'd been prepared for exactly this version of events since the day he first started joining board calls as an observer. The reversion notice went out at 4:47 p.m. on Tuesday. Certified mail to the company's registered agent, electronic copies to every board member's personal email, the company's general counsel, outside regulatory counsel, and the FDA liaison contact on record for our pending BLA submission. Not because I wanted to be dramatic, because those were the exact parties identified in the licensing agreement as required notification recipients. I also included a 1-page summary of what the reversion meant for each active regulatory submission, written in plain language, with specific citation to the relevant FDA guidance documents. I'd been writing compliance documentation for 31 years. I knew how to make something impossible to misread. The company's general counsel, a woman I'd worked with for 9 years, sharp and unflappable, called me at 6:15 p.m. Please tell me you're open to negotiating this. I'm always open to a conversation, I said. But the reversion is filed. That's not negotiable. Whatever comes next is a new agreement. A silence. Professional. Careful. How soon can you meet? I'm available tomorrow morning, not at Crestline's offices. Understood. I'll find a location. The board called an emergency session for Wednesday at 9 a.m. I know because 2 members called me directly that evening, not to negotiate, just to understand what they were looking at. Both of them had been on the board for over a decade. Both of them knew the licensing agreement existed. It appeared in every annual disclosure, but neither of them had ever read Exhibit C closely enough to understand what it actually said. One of them told me, with some emotion in his voice, that he wished I'd warned him. I told him I'd spent 31 years building something in this company. I'd earned the right to protect it. He didn't argue with that. My son-in-law didn't call. Not that night. My daughter called at 8 p.m. That was a harder conversation. She wasn't angry, exactly. More confused, trying to reconcile the version of events her husband had given her. Me being difficult, me refusing to accept a graceful transition, with the version that was now showing up in emails to every board member's inbox. Dad, he said this was your idea. Some of it was. The part where I spent 6 months training him was my idea. The part where he fired me without cause the week he took over was not. A long quiet. He said the licensing thing is just a legal technicality. It's not a technicality. It's the reason your great-grandfather's company can legally sell the 3 drugs it's currently selling and potentially approve 2 more. Without it, they have a compliance gap that could delay the BLA by 18 months and force revalidation of every process currently in production. Another silence. How long have you had this in place? Since 2003. She didn't say anything for a moment. Did you set this up because you knew something like this might happen? I thought about how to answer that honestly. I set it up because I built something valuable, and I wanted to make sure it couldn't be taken from me. I didn't know your husband would be the one to try. She said she needed time to think. I told her I understood. I meant it. This part wasn't clean. Family never is. The emergency board meeting started at 9 a.m. Wednesday. I arrived at the neutral location, a conference room at an attorney's office downtown, at 8:55. There were 6 people at the table, 5 board members and the general counsel. My son-in-law was not there. He had been told the meeting was a legal review session. Technically accurate. I sat down, opened my folder, and waited. The general counsel walked through the situation with the precision of someone who had spent the previous 16 hours reading documents she wished she'd read years earlier. The proprietary documentation framework, the licensing structure, Exhibit C and its termination clause, the current regulatory submissions that depended on the framework's continued validity, the 90-day window, the BLA. When she finished, the board chair, a man in his late 60s who had served since the early days of the company and had known me for over 20 years, looked at me directly. "What do you need to make this right, Walter?" That was the first time anyone had asked me that. I'd gone by Walt my whole career, but he always used the full name when things were serious, I noticed. "I need the termination rescinded. I need the termination rescinded. I need my role reinstated with appropriate authority over the regulatory and operations functions that depend on this framework. And I need a board-level review of how the CEO transition was handled, with particular attention to the documentation around my departure." The chair nodded slowly. "And the licensing agreement? Remains in my name. That's not changing. But if my position is reinstated and my professional standing is restored, the reversion clause has no practical effect. I have no interest in disrupting this company's regulatory pipeline. I built it." The general counsel spoke. "If we rescind the termination, legally, the license reverts back to standard terms. The reversion clause only triggers on a without cause firing." "Correct. Then we need to vote." The chair looked around the table. "I don't think we need much deliberation. We have 4 people in this room who've worked with Walter for over 15 years. We know exactly who built what here." The vote was 4-1 in favor of rescinding my termination and reinstating my position. 1 abstention from the board member who'd been having lunches with my son-in-law. 4-1. That's enough. My son-in-law found out at approximately 10:30 a.m. Wednesday when the general counsel met with him privately in his office, the one that used to be mine, and explained what had occurred. I was not in that meeting. I don't know exactly what was said, but I know that by noon, his nameplate was no longer on the door, and HR had been instructed to begin a review of his employment agreement. He called me at 12:47 p.m. I let it go to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. The hardest part wasn't any of the legal mechanics. I'd been prepared for those for years. The hardest part was walking back into the building on Thursday morning and seeing the people who'd watched Tuesday happen and hadn't said anything. Some of them wouldn't meet my eyes. Others went out of their way to say hello with a warmth that felt like apology. A few came to my office privately and said things they probably should have said sooner. I appreciated all of it and held none of it against anyone. Fear is a rational response to watching someone with power decide to use it carelessly. Nobody is obligated to throw themselves in the path of that. What I cared about was the work. We had a BLA submission deadline in 6 weeks. My team had been operating in limbo for 48 hours, waiting to find out if the compliance infrastructure they'd built their careers around was suddenly in legal uncertainty. The moment I was back in the building, I called a department meeting and told them simply that we were on track, nothing had changed in the documentation framework, and we had a deadline to hit. They got back to work. So did I. The BLA went out on schedule. 5 months later, the FDA accepted it for review. That review is still ongoing as of today. But the submission is clean, fully compliant, and built on 31 years of process documentation that I own. My son-in-law and my daughter are working through their situation privately. I won't say more about that. It's their life, and I respect that. The board restructured the CEO transition entirely. I'm not CEO, I never wanted that. But my role was expanded. My compensation was adjusted to reflect what the company had apparently been underpaying for a while, and the licensing agreement was formally recognized in the company's governance documents in a way it never had been before. The board member who'd abstained came to my office 2 weeks after the vote. He sat down without being invited, looked at the wall behind me where I keep nothing except a single framed copy of our first FDA approval letter, and said, "I should have told you what was happening." "Yes," I said. "You should have. I'm sorry." "I know." And that was that. Here's what I want you to take from this. Not a motivational platitude. Not a lesson you could put on a coffee mug. 31 years ago, a young attorney sat with me in a conference room and asked what I actually wanted from this company. Not the title, not the salary. The thing I wanted to make sure couldn't be taken from me. I had to think hard about that. Because what I'd built wasn't a product. It wasn't a relationship or a reputation, though those matter too. It was a system. A body of work that had a specific, documented, legally distinct form. And once I understood that I could own it. Most people in my position never think to ask that question. They build and assume that longevity is protection, that years of service create some kind of institutional gravity that holds things in place. It doesn't. Loyalty is not a contract. Relationships are not equity. What protects you is documentation, and what documentation protects is yours. The day my son-in-law read that termination script off his screen, he wasn't just making a personnel decision. He was pulling a thread he didn't know was connected to the load-bearing wall. Some walls you don't find out are load-bearing until you start pulling. If this is the kind of story that makes you think differently about what you've built and what belongs to you, I'd love to know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the moments when corporate authority runs headfirst into something it should have read more carefully, subscribe. There are more where this came from, trust me. I've thought a lot about why it played out the way it did. Not the legal mechanics, those were straightforward, almost boring in how cleanly they executed. What I keep coming back to is the chain of choices that led every person in that story to exactly where they ended up. My son-in-law made a decision on his second week in that chair that he thought was about power. It wasn't. It was about impatience. He'd spent years positioning himself to inherit something he didn't build, and the moment he finally had the title, he moved fast to clear out anyone who might remind the room that the foundation existed before he arrived. That's not strategy. That's insecurity wearing a lanyard. And here's what I've learned about insecurity in positions of authority. It always overreaches. Always. Because it's not operating from a clear reading of the situation. It's operating from fear of being exposed. He didn't fire me because I was a problem. He fired me because I was a mirror and he didn't like what he saw. The cause and effect isn't complicated. He took an action without understanding what that action was connected to. He didn't read the documents, didn't ask the right questions, assumed that 31 years of someone's work was interchangeable with 31 years of someone's presence, that you could remove the person and keep the infrastructure running on its own. That's the mistake of someone who has never actually built anything from the ground up. When you build something yourself, you understand that systems have authors. You understand that knowledge doesn't live in servers or filing cabinets. It lives in the person who designed it, revised it, defended it in front of federal regulators, and spent nights thinking about what would happen if it failed. What I want people to take from this is not that I was clever. I was prepared. There's a difference. Being clever is a reaction. Being prepared is a choice you make years in advance when nothing is on fire and nobody is threatening you. Because you understand that the time to protect what you've built is before someone tries to take it. The intelligence involved wasn't exceptional. It was just applied consistently, over time, to a problem most people in my position never take seriously. What do I actually own here? And what form does that ownership take? Not in the emotional sense. In the documented, legally distinct, enforceable sense. And the character part of it. The part that I think gets skipped over in these kinds of stories is that I never wanted to use that clause. I put it in place as a last resort and spent 3 decades hoping it would never matter. I was there to do the work. That's what I cared about. The protection existed so that I could focus on the work without looking over my shoulder. When my son-in-law made his move, I didn't celebrate. I made a phone call, drank my coffee, and waited. Because that's what the situation actually required. Not anger, not performance, not a confrontation in his office. Just the next right step, taken calmly, in the correct order. That's the whole thing, really. Do the work. Protect what you build. Know what you own. And when someone mistakes your patience for passivity, let the documents do the talking. They're much more persuasive than I ever needed to be.